Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong, no matter how hard you'd worked, how far you'd come? Imagine sitting in a first-class seat you paid for. A quiet moment before takeoff. You're calm, composed, until a flight supervisor steps in front of you and says, "Sir, that restroom isn't for you." The cabin falls silent. Eyes turn. You feel the weight of every stare pressing down. Now, what would you do? Would you argue, shout, demand respect, or would you stay silent and let dignity speak louder than anger? For Marcus Ellington, one of the most powerful black CEOs in America, that moment wasn't just humiliation, it was a crossroads. What he did next didn't just defend his own dignity. It changed an entire airline, and maybe even the skies themselves. Because sometimes, justice doesn't roar. It whispers and then rewrites the rules. If you've ever faced injustice and wondered whether calm strength can truly win, this story will stay with you long after it ends. Stay with us till the end. Hit like, share, and subscribe to follow stories that remind us all dignity is not optional. The flight attendant's smile skipped a seat. Marcus Ellington noticed it the moment he stepped into the first-class cabin of Sky Nation Flight 451. He had flown often enough to recognize the choreography of courtesy, the champagne waiting on polished trays, the way attendants leaned in with exaggerated warmth for certain passengers, the carefully curated glow of exclusivity. But when Marcus slid into his seat, Tue, the lead supervisor, a tall man with graying temples and sharp blue eyes, did not bother with the practiced grin. He gave Marcus a quick, measuring look, then turned his head as though the man seated there had simply disappeared. It wasn't the first time Marcus had been treated this way, yet the sting of it so small, so quiet, so cutting, still pressed against his ribs. He set down his leather briefcase, adjusted his jacket, and exhaled. The plane was still boarding. A woman in pearls struggled with an overhead bin 2 rows down. A young couple argued gently over who would take the window seat. Across the aisle, an older white businessman was greeted with a familiar laugh from the same supervisor who had ignored Marcus. "Mr. Turner, always good to see you again," the man said, voice booming with recognition. Marcus glanced at his hands, broad, steady, the kind of hands that had once pulled greasy tools in a Georgia auto shop when he was 16. Back then, he had scrubbed them raw with soap, thinking if he could just scrub hard enough, the world might see him differently. It never did. Now, decades later, those same hands signed billion-dollar contracts. They pushed Orion Global, the clean energy empire he had built from the ground up, into every corner of the American grid. Yet in the eyes of a flight supervisor on a Tuesday morning, they were still just the hands of a black man who didn't quite belong in 2A. He lifted the glass of water placed on the center console, lukewarm, half filled. No lemon slice, no napkin. He looked at it, then set it back down untouched. A flicker of memory stirred. He was 10 years old, standing on the side of a rural highway in Georgia with his mother. They had walked miles in blistering summer heat. Her car broken down, sweat rolling down her temples. He remembered begging her to stop at a gas station for water. He remembered the sign, "Restroom for customers only." He remembered her low voice, tired, humiliated as the cashier shook his head. "Not for your kind." That boy had swallowed his thirst, just as the man in Tuo swallowed the dull ache pressing against his chest now. "Mr. Ellington," a soft voice interrupted. Marcus looked up. It was the flight attendant assigned to first class, a young woman, maybe mid-20s, with an apologetic smile hovering at the corners of her lips. She leaned closer, as though to soften the words that would follow. "Would you like champagne before takeoff?" she asked. For a moment, Marcus considered it. He pictured the golden bubbles, the small comfort, but his eyes flicked toward the supervisor standing a few feet away, arms folded, gaze fixed across the cabin. He saw the disdain there, the unspoken message. "Don't make yourself too comfortable." "No, thank you," Marcus replied evenly. His voice was calm, warm even. Years of boardrooms had taught him how to bury sharpness beneath civility. The attendant nodded quickly and moved on. Marcus turned his attention toward the window. The jet bridge was pulling away. Ground crew in neon vests moved like ants below. He could see the reflection of his own face in the glass creased at the edges, calm, composed. Yet behind the composure was that same question he had carried for years. Why do I still have to prove I belong? He closed his eyes briefly, trying to steady his breathing. When he opened them, the supervisor was still watching him. Not openly, not enough to cause a scene, just small, clipped glances, like an officer checking that a suspect hadn't slipped the cuffs. Marcus had weathered harsher storms, shareholder rebellions, federal hearings, betrayals by men in $1,000 suits. But humiliation quiet, unprovoked humiliation had a way of unearthing wounds the years had never fully closed. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." The cabin dimmed. Engines hummed deeper. Marcus leaned back in his seat and clasped his hands loosely in his lap. He told himself, as he had many times before, "Stay calm. Don't give them your anger. Don't let them script you into their stereotype." Still, he could not shake the sense that something was already set in motion. The businessman across the aisle. Turner was laughing with the supervisor again. Headed to the Bay Same conference, Marcus caught fragments of their conversation. Golf trips, mutual friends, inside jokes about some executive in Chicago. The sound was a reminder there were circles he could buy his way into, but never truly enter. The plane lifted. The cabin swayed gently, then steadied. Marcus closed his eyes, letting the vibration of the engines rumble through him. He thought of his daughter, Simone, in her first year at Columbia Law, of his late father, who had hauled bricks for 30 years, who had once told him, "Son, you'll have to be twice as good to get half as far." He had been more than twice as good. He had built an empire. And still, here he was reduced in an instant by a glance too cold to ignore. A soft chime sounded. Seatbelt lights blinked off. The businessman rose leisurely, making his way toward the restroom at the front of the cabin. The supervisor stepped aside with a smile, almost a bow, ushering him through the narrow door. Marcus shifted in his seat. His body reminded him that he, too, needed to stand, to walk those few steps, to claim what he had paid for, what was rightfully his. But when he did, when he rose, unhurried, and began his quiet walk down the aisle, he felt the air change. The supervisor moved, like a sentry. He slid in front of the restroom door. One arm braced casually against the frame. His voice was low, but it carried. "This restroom is reserved," he said. "Please return to your seat." Marcus stopped. "I'm seated in 2A," he answered, his tone measured, polite. "First-class ticket." The supervisor's jaw flexed. "We've had issues with people like you before. Please sit down." For a second, silence blanketed the cabin, then whispers, then the unmistakable click of someone's phone camera beginning to record. Marcus stood there, heart steady, face unreadable, inside. However, The old wound tore open. Here we are again, he thought. Same door, same wordless wall. He looked past the supervisor at the silver latch of the restroom door. It was so close, yet barred not by metal, but by something far heavier prejudice that refused to die. He lowered his eyes, then raised them again, meeting the supervisor's gaze with quiet steel, and without another word, Marcus turned back toward his seat. But as he sat down, his fingers brushed the cool face of his watch. It was more than a watch. It was the nerve center of Orion Global's secure network. And with 3 taps, silent and discreet, Marcus Ellington could turn humiliation into something else entirely. He took a slow breath, steady as stone. If they insist on writing me into this story, he thought, then I'll be the one holding the pen. The hush in the cabin lingered long after Marcus returned to his seat. Conversations picked up again, but not in the same way. Words floated in half-whispers, cautious, as if passengers knew they had witnessed something they weren't supposed to. A man in the 3rd row cleared his throat and pretended to study his newspaper. A young woman tilted her phone, angling discreetly toward Marcus as though she might catch him reacting. Marcus sat still, spine straight, hands folded in his lap, outwardly calm. Inside, however, a familiar debate churned. Should he say something? Stand, announce who he was, and demand the respect due to any passenger. Part of him longed for it. The fire that rose in his chest begged to be heard. Yet another part, older, steadier, whispered caution. He could almost hear his father's voice again. You don't get to be angry in public. Son, they don't see the reasons. They only see the rage. He pressed his thumb against the edge of his watch. Just 3 taps, and the entire encounter would be preserved, logged, transmitted. It was tempting, but for the moment, he held back. Across the aisle, Mr. Turner returned from the restroom with a satisfied sigh, tugging at his jacket as though refreshed. He glanced at Marcus, not unkindly, but with the smugness of someone who had passed unchallenged through a door that had been slammed shut for another. He sat down heavily and waved for a refill of his champagne. The attendant obliged instantly. Marcus's throat was dry, but he didn't ask for water again. He looked around the cabin. He saw people carefully avoiding his gaze. That avoidance was its own kind of cruelty. He thought, not the open hostility of the supervisor, but a quiet agreement that what had just happened was better left ignored. He leaned his head back, letting the hum of the engines fill his ears. In that vibration, he found himself drifting backward through memory. Another restroom door. Another day. He was 16, on a long bus ride to a mechanic's job 2 towns over. The bus stopped for a break, and he had rushed to the station restroom, desperate, only to be waved away by a man leaning against the tiled wall. Not for you, the man had said, jerking his head toward a crooked sign that marked the colored facility across the lot. Marcus had walked away that day, fists clenched, ashamed of the tears burning his eyes. He had promised himself then that he would never let anyone see him small. And here he was, 32 years later, still being told he didn't belong at a restroom door. The irony cut deep. The supervisor, Cliff Harlow, walked past Marcus's row, his shoes clicking softly on the carpet. He didn't look down, but his presence was loud enough. His clipped movements, the rigid posture. It was all theater, Marcus realized. Theater meant to send a message to the rest of the cabin, I'm in control here. But Marcus knew something Cliff did not. Control was a fragile illusion. Real power didn't parade itself. Real power sat quietly, waiting. biding time, until the right moment arrived. The young attendant from earlier passed by again, her expression nervous, as though she wanted to apologize but didn't dare. She placed a napkin on Marcus's tray table, almost a whisper of an offering. He gave her a small nod. Her eyes flickered with gratitude before she hurried on. Marcus unfolded the napkin slowly, placing it flat before him, white, crisp, untouched. For some reason, it felt symbolic, a small reminder that not everyone on this plane had chosen silence. He thought again about tapping his watch. The temptation gnawed. Protocol Horizon wasn't just a recording tool. It was a system designed for exactly these moments, documenting bias, linking incidents, creating patterns that no corporation could deny. But was this the right moment to trigger it? Or would it look like overreaction? Another angry man refusing to let it go. The plane jolted slightly as it entered a patch of turbulence. Glasses rattled. Someone gasped. Marcus held the armrest but kept his breathing even. The seatbelt light blinked back on. Cliff's voice carried down the aisle. "Remain seated, please, for your own safety." Marcus almost laughed at the words. Safety, he thought. They loved that word. It covered so much, kept the world polite while injustice wore its quiet mask. When the plane steadied again, Cliff moved toward the galley. He paused once more near Marcus, gaze cold, calculating. Marcus met it with calm, steady eyes. He gave nothing away. Inside, though, his mind was already moving. He thought of Orion's database, of the countless reports his company had helped compile about bias in corporate culture, in hiring, in customer service. He thought of the leverage those numbers carried in shareholder meetings. He thought of his silent stake in Sky Nation itself. Numbers tucked quietly into portfolios, never flaunted, always waiting. If Cliff Harlow wanted to play power games in the narrow aisle of a cabin, Marcus had an entire arsenal waiting just beyond the thin shell of this airplane. Still, he waited. He wanted to see how far they would go. The businessman ordered another drink. The couple across the row whispered into each other's shoulders, pretending not to notice anything. Marcus sat, shoulders loose, eyes half closed. To anyone looking, he was a man at rest. But his mind was already setting pieces on a larger chessboard. In 10 minutes, he told himself, everything could change. And this time, it wouldn't just be about a restroom door. The hum of the engine softened into a steady background rhythm. Marcus Ellington's gaze lingered on the napkin the young attendant had placed before him. White, folded, simple. It was nothing, and yet everything a reminder that dignity could be acknowledged in small gestures. Even when authority chose otherwise, he leaned back against the leather seat and let his fingers hover near the watch on his wrist. The Orionx, a sleek device that most passengers would assume was a high-end smartwatch. For Marcus, it was far more. It was a silent key to a vault of systems and protocols designed to gather truth, expose hidden patterns, and protect those who had no shield against humiliation. He tapped the glass once. Nothing happened outwardly. Another tap. Still nothing visible. The third tap was deliberate, slow, as though pressing against the weight of every memory of being told not for you. Inside the Orion network, the signal moved instantly. Thousands of miles away in Orion's Manhattan headquarters, a soft chime alerted Phoebe Tran. Sharp, decisive. She had been Marcus's chief of legal strategy for years. She leaned over her desk, eyes narrowing as the alert scrolled across her screen. Protocol Horizon. Activated. Subject Sky Nation Flight 451. Phoebe stood immediately, gathering her team. Within seconds, Data began to stream cabin cameras, audio fragments, passenger manifests. Horizon didn't hack. It leveraged the very compliance contracts Sky Nation had signed with Orion for aviation technology support. Marcus had written those clauses himself, quietly embedding accountability into the system years ago. Back on the plane, Marcus folded his hands, calm as stone. No one around him knew that the humiliation at a restroom door had just become evidence in a chain larger than one flight. Cliff Harlow, the supervisor, returned from the galley, checking seatbelts, postures, trays. His eyes flickered again toward Marcus, a look of control, half suspicion, half satisfaction. Marcus met the look with stillness. Outwardly unshaken, inwardly, he was cataloging every detail. The businessman Turner across the aisle was chuckling into his phone, telling someone about the delay earlier, his voice full of ease. Yeah, smooth flight. Good service as always. His words cut sharper than he intended, as though mocking the truth Marcus had just lived. Marcus turned his gaze back toward the window. Below, clouds spread like endless fields of white. Above, the sky was a clean blue, indifferent to the drama inside a pressurized tube of metal. He thought briefly about how many millions of people stepped into flights every day, trusting that dignity came with the price of a ticket. How fragile that assumption really was. Phoebe's voice entered through a secure channel to his watch. A single vibration. Then her words, soft and direct. We have confirmation. Harlow has 3 prior complaints buried by management. 2 dismissed internally. 1 settled quietly. We also found archived footage. Another passenger of color denied service last year. Marcus's jaw tightened, though his expression stayed even. Log everything, he whispered, his lips barely moving. Already in process. FAA notified. Do you want escalation now? Not yet. He ended the transmission with a silent blink to his watch. Patience, he reminded himself. His father had always told him, don't fight in the street when you can win in the courthouse. Marcus had built on that lesson, turning it into a strategy. Don't fight in the aisle when you can win in the boardroom. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane moved westward. A soft twilight filled the space, giving the illusion of calm. But Marcus could feel the tension humming beneath it, like an electric current waiting to spark. The young attendant passed again, pausing just a moment. Are you comfortable, sir? She asked, her voice low. Marcus offered her a small nod. Thank you. I'm fine. Her eyes darted briefly toward Cliff, then back to Marcus. She seemed to want to say more, but didn't. She moved on quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted another passenger's blanket. Marcus felt a pang of empathy. She was young, perhaps just beginning her career, caught between what was right and what authority demanded. He wondered how many times people like her had been silenced by fear of losing a job. Cliff's footsteps echoed again, closer this time. He paused beside Marcus's row, looking down with the faintest smirk. Is there a problem, sir? He asked, his tone too polite to be genuine. Marcus looked up slowly. His voice was level, his words chosen with precision. No problem at all. Cliff tilted his head, clearly dissatisfied with the lack of reaction. He lingered a moment longer before moving away. Marcus exhaled. That was the moment he knew. He would not let this slide, not for himself alone, but for everyone who had walked away from doors like this, swallowing humiliation in silence. He tapped the watch again, sending a final trigger. Across the Orion network, the signal expanded. Every relevant piece of evidence was now mirrored to independent legal servers. FAA representatives were en route to Denver, the scheduled refueling stop, and the Sky Nation board, many of whom owed their voting leverage to Orion Global's silent stakes, would soon receive a call they could not ignore. Marcus sat back, calm, composed. Outwardly, just another man on a flight. Inwardly, a strategist pulling invisible strings. He thought of Simone, his daughter. What would she say if she saw this moment? He could almost hear her voice. "Dad, you always said dignity matters most when it's tested." He smiled faintly at the thought. The engines droned, the cabin hummed, and in that quiet, Marcus Ellington prepared not just to reclaim his dignity, but to force an entire system to confront its own reflection. The announcement of descent into Denver was routine, almost soothing, but Marcus Ellington knew that nothing about what was about to happen would be ordinary. He sat still, shoulders relaxed, while the cabin stirred with the low buzz of passengers preparing for a brief stop. Some stretched, others checked their phones, unaware that the flight was about to veer into history. Cliff Harlow moved with authority, striding down the aisle, making sure belts were fastened and trays locked. He carried himself like a man who owned the space, chest slightly puffed, chin lifted. To him, Marcus was just another passenger subdued by quiet humiliation. He had seen that look before. He assumed. He thought this was the end of it. But Marcus's watch pulsed once, a vibration no one else could hear. Protocol Horizon had completed its sweep. Evidence was secured, transmitted, and in the hands of people who mattered. FAA officials were waiting. The landing was smooth, wheels kissing the runway with a gentle thud. Applause rippled faintly from a few passengers. Denver International Airport's lights glowed beyond the windows. An ordinary stop on an extraordinary day. As the aircraft taxied toward a remote gate, Marcus noted the sudden tension in the cabin crew. Whispered voices in the galley. Hurried glances. A stiffness in movement. Something had filtered through the headset channels. Cliff's face tightened as he checked his tablet, jaw clenching, color rising along his neck. The door opened with a hiss. Instead of catering crew, two men in dark jackets boarded, their badges flashing under the dim cabin lights. They were FAA officials, flanked by a Sky Nation security officer and, to Cliff's surprise, a poised woman in a Navy suit. Phoebe Tran. Gas traveled through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks, phones discreetly lifted. The moment had shifted. Everyone could feel it. "Mr. Harlow," one official said firmly, "we need you to gather your belongings and come with us." Cliff froze. His voice sharpened as he tried to laugh it off. "This is ridiculous. I'm supervising an active flight." Phoebe stepped forward, her tone calm but cutting. "You're being removed under suspension pending investigation. This isn't optional." Cliff turned red. His eyes darted across the cabin, as if searching for allies. "Investigation? For what? Doing my job." Marcus remained in his seat, his gaze steady but silent. He didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't flinch. He simply watched. The passengers, however, began to murmur. Some whispered what they had seen earlier at the restroom door. A woman in row 3 raised her voice. "I recorded it." "He stopped that gentleman for no reason." She gestured toward Marcus. Others nodded. Voices overlapping confirmation. Small pieces of truth now converging. Cliff's composure cracked. "You people don't understand." His words faltered under the weight of cameras, now openly recording. The official repeated firmly, "Gather your things, sir. Now." Reluctantly. Cliff yanked his bag from the overhead bin. His hand shook. his fury naked as he turned back down the aisle. But the authority he clung to had evaporated. What had once been smug control was now a stumble, a forced march through a gauntlet of watching eyes. As he moved past Marcus, their eyes met. Cliff searched for some reaction, some flash of triumph or anger, but Marcus's face remained calm, unreadable, dignified. That calmness cut deeper than any words. Passengers clapped as Cliff was escorted out. The applause was uneven, tentative at first, then growing louder, a release of tension. Phones rose higher, live streams rolling, hashtags already forming. Marcus sat still, a quiet center in the storm. He hadn't spoken a single word to cause this scene, yet everything had unfolded exactly as it needed to. Phoebe paused near his seat, her voice low, meant only for him. Step 1 is complete. FAA has jurisdiction now. Evidence is secure. Do you want me to escalate to the board? Marcus's lips curved into the faintest smile. Not yet. Let the public see the truth first. She nodded, moving briskly off the plane with the officials. The cabin buzzed like a shaken hive. Turner, across the aisle, muttered something about overreaction, but kept his voice low when he saw phones aimed his way. A mother soothed her child, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. Everything's fine." For Marcus, it wasn't about fine. It was about visible accountability. Cliff Harlow had been removed not in a private office, not in some hidden HR meeting, but right there in the aisle where he had chosen to humiliate another man. The symmetry mattered. The captain's voice broke through the intercom, strained but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be on the ground here briefly. Please remain seated. We appreciate your patience." Marcus closed his eyes, letting the applause echo in his mind. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a signal. He remembered Simone again, her words echoing. Dignity matters most when it's tested. This was that test, played out under dim cabin lights and the eyes of strangers. His fingers brushed the watch once more, ready for the next move. He knew what came next would be larger than a supervisor. This wasn't about Cliff alone. This was about the system that had protected him. Outside the window, trucks rolled across the tarmac, headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, Marcus felt the quiet shift of momentum. The humiliation of a restroom door had transformed into the first public crack in Sky Nation's facade, and Marcus Ellington, calm and composed, was ready to widen it. When the plane finally continued on toward San Francisco, the cabin felt strangely lighter. Passengers settled into a hush of whispered conversations, the earlier tension replaced by the thrill of having witnessed something unusual. Marcus Ellington remained calm, but his mind was already beyond the walls of the aircraft. He had set the first domino in motion. The fall of Cliff Harlow was only the beginning. By the time Marcus stepped into the private terminal in San Francisco, Orion's legal division had already prepared the next phase. Phoebe Tran was waiting in a quiet lounge, tablet in hand, her eyes sharp and steady. "Media is circling already," she told him in a low voice. "Videos are trending. FAA has confirmed they're opening a case. But the bigger piece, Sky Nation's board won't be able to ignore this. Not with what we've uncovered." Marcus adjusted the cuff of his jacket, his expression unreadable. "They think this is about one supervisor. It isn't. It's about a system that allowed him to survive 3 complaints and stay in power." Phoebe slid the tablet across the table. Dozens of files filled the screen, internal memos, buried reports, dismissed complaints, evidence of patterns too clear to deny. "We've traced 37 separate incidents over the past 5 years," she explained. "Passengers of color, immigrants, even a disabled veteran. All minimized, all hidden. Marcus studied the data, his jaw set. He remembered every door in his life that had been closed unjustly. Now those doors would open in the most public way possible. That evening, the Sky Nation board convened in New York for what they thought was a routine emergency meeting. The executives gathered in a polished glass tower overlooking the city. Their faces were pale, unsettled, knowing that news of Cliff's removal had already leaked to the press. What they didn't expect was to see Marcus Ellington join the meeting by secure video link, his calm presence filling the screen. "Mr. Ellington," the chairman began, voice strained. "This is a Sky Nation matter," Marcus interrupted gently but firmly. "This is an Orion matter, too. You signed contracts with us. Compliance, accountability, oversight. And today, those contracts were tested." Several board members shifted uncomfortably. They all knew Orion Global was not just a vendor. It was a silent power within the airline's infrastructure, controlling the systems that tracked passengers, monitored compliance, and ensured federal standards. What few in the room realized was that Marcus himself had leveraged Orion's holdings to acquire a silent but substantial stake in Sky Nation. Marcus let the silence linger before speaking again. "I hold 19% of your stock directly. Through Orion, I control proxy agreements totaling 61% of your voting rights, which means I am not a guest at this table. I am the table." The words landed like thunder. The room froze. Some executives looked at each other in shock, others in resignation. They had underestimated the man they had tried to humiliate on a plane. Phoebe's voice came through the speakerphone, steady and precise. "We've compiled all evidence of systemic misconduct. If made public, your liability would be catastrophic. Shareholders would revolt. Regulators would intervene." Marcus leaned slightly forward, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "You have a choice. You can resign voluntarily tonight and allow this company to reform, or I will move a shareholder action tomorrow morning that removes you by force. Either way, your system of silence ends here." The chairman swallowed, his face pale. One by one, hands folded, papers shuffled. The realization spread that the old guard had no leverage left. Finally, the CEO cleared his throat. What exactly do you propose?" Marcus's eyes held steady. "Not revenge, reform. You will step down, and Sky Nation will adopt the Clear Skies Initiative comprehensive equity training, independent complaint review, leadership rotation to prevent entrenched abuse, and public reporting every 6 months. You will acknowledge this publicly. You will make accountability your new standard." The CEO looked around the room, searching for defiance. None came. He lowered his head. "I'll sign." Phoebe transmitted the documents electronically. Within minutes, signatures appeared on the screen. One by one, the board surrendered their power to a man they had thought was just another passenger. Marcus remained calm, never raising his voice, never gloating. He simply watched the signatures fill the digital page. When it was done, he spoke softly. "This isn't about me. This is about the next black child who grows up believing that every door is closed. I won't let Sky Nation be one of those doors again." The executives sat in silence. They knew the tide had turned. The age of ignoring complaints, of burying shame, was over. When the meeting ended, Marcus leaned back in his chair in San Francisco, the city lights glowing beyond the window. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a long breath, not of triumph, but of resolve. The battle had moved from the aisle of a plane to the heart of a corporation, and Marcus Ellington had made it clear dignity would no longer be negotiable. The morning after the boardroom reckoning, New York woke up to headlines that made commuters pause mid-step on the sidewalks. Digital billboards in Times Square flashed bold letters: Sky Nation faces. Historic shakeup after first-class scandal. News anchors repeated Marcus Ellington's name with a mix of intrigue and reverence, his calm face appearing on every screen. The footage of Cliff Harlow being escorted off the plane had already gone viral overnight. Passengers' video showed not just his removal, but also the quiet dignity of Marcus sitting in his seat, hands folded, saying nothing while the cabin applauded. Commentators replayed the scene endlessly, pointing out the striking contrast: arrogance against composure, abuse of power against patient strength. Marcus didn't seek the spotlight, but the spotlight had found him. His office at Orion's San Francisco headquarters buzzed with activity. Reporters camped outside the glass building. Civil rights groups requested statements. Shareholders demanded clarity. The world was watching. Phoebe Tran stepped into Marcus's office, tablet in hand as always, her voice steady despite the frenzy outside. You're trending across every platform. Hashtags are exploding. Clear the skies. There's dignity in flight. Marcus Ellington. Some are calling this the most significant passenger rights movement in aviation history. Marcus listened quietly, his eyes fixed on the window view of the bay. It's not about hashtags, he said softly. It's about whether people who never had a voice will finally be heard. Phoebe nodded. Still, you need to address the public. Silence now could be misinterpreted. They want to hear from you. Marcus hesitated. He had built his career on strategy, not speeches. But he knew Phoebe was right. If he didn't frame the story, others would. He leaned back, recalling Simone's words once again. When you speak, speak for more than yourself. Later that afternoon, Marcus stepped onto a small stage at Orion's press room. Cameras clicked, lights flashed. He adjusted the microphone, his suit sharp but his demeanor gentle, as though speaking across a dinner table instead of to millions of viewers. I never intended for this to become a public spectacle. He began. What happened on Flight 227 was not about one man being denied a restroom. It was about a system that quietly decides who belongs and who does not. And when that system humiliates one of us, it humiliates all of us. The room fell silent, every word carefully carried. Marcus didn't raise his voice, but his calm authority filled the space. He continued, I have the privilege of resources and influence. Many do not. This is why change cannot depend on isolated cases or hidden settlements. It must be systemic, transparent, and lasting. Reporters scribbled. Cameras zoomed closer. That is why, Marcus announced. Effective immediately. Sky Nation will adopt the Clear Skies Initiative, independent review of all passenger complaints, mandatory cultural competency training for every employee, and biannual public reporting of outcomes. This is not a suggestion. It is a binding directive under Orion's oversight. The words rippled through the press room. A directive, not a proposal. Marcus had ensured it. He concluded with quiet strength. Dignity is not a privilege reserved for some. It is a right owed to all. And I intend to see that right honored, in the skies and beyond. Applause broke out, not the wild kind of entertainment shows, but the firm applause of people who recognized truth spoken plainly. The clip spread across networks within the hour, replayed on every news cycle, analyzed line by line. Yet even as Marcus spoke, resistance brewed in the shadows. In a corner office in Manhattan, Turner, the first-class passenger who had sneered at Marcus during the flight, watched the broadcast with narrowed eyes. His family had ties to Sky Nation's old board, and he bristled at seeing their influence crumble. He picked up his phone, calling an ally in the press. "They're turning him into a hero," Turner muttered. "You and I both know there's money behind this. Dig into Orion, find something, anything." But attempts to discredit Marcus fell flat. Every investigation uncovered only more credibility, his quiet philanthropy, scholarships for underrepresented youth, his track record of ethical leadership. Instead of scandal, the digging revealed a man whose integrity had always been his shield. In the days that followed, ordinary people began sharing their own stories under the hashtag Clear the Skies. A Latina mother recounted being forced to check her child's medical equipment while white passengers carried larger bags without question. An Asian businessman shared how he was repeatedly asked to prove his first-class boarding pass. A disabled veteran described humiliation when attendants doubted his service dog. Marcus read these stories late into the night, sitting by his desk with only the soft hum of the city outside. Each account weighed heavily, each a reminder that the restroom door was just a symbol of countless unseen doors. He closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. But then he thought of Simone again, of her laughter on a quiet evening years ago. She would have told him, "You're not carrying this alone. You're carrying it so others don't have to." The next morning, Marcus convened Orion's leadership team. Phoebe sat at his right, while legal, tech, and strategy chiefs filled the room. "We can't stop with Sky Nation," Marcus said plainly. "This isn't just one airline sickness. It's the industry, maybe beyond." Heads nodded around the table. One executive leaned forward. "We could expand Clear Skies into a broader coalition, invite other carriers, regulators, advocacy groups, turn it into a standard." Marcus's gaze was steady. Not a coalition, a covenant, one that no airline can ignore without losing public trust. If Sky Nation is the first, others will follow. The idea was bold, ambitious, but it had momentum. The media already painted Marcus as the architect of a new era in aviation. Now, he would use that narrative to reshape the system itself. Outside, the streets buzzed with protesters carrying signs that read, "Dignity doesn't wait, and we all belong in the sky." The movement had grown beyond Marcus, beyond the boardroom. It had become a fire no one could contain. For Marcus, the storm was both a burden and a calling. He hadn't asked for fame, but now he carried something heavier expectation. The world believed he could change the skies, and maybe, just maybe, he could. The swell of public support for the Clear Skies initiative seemed unstoppable. Media outlets framed Marcus Ellington as a reluctant hero. Civil rights leaders hailed him as a bridge between corporate power and community advocacy. And passengers around the world demanded other airlines follow Sky Nation's lead. For a brief moment, it looked as though the tide of history was rolling smoothly in his favor. But Marcus had lived long enough to know that no tide moved without undertow. It began with whispers. Phoebe Tran intercepted chatter in regulatory circles, anonymous leaks suggesting that Marcus had engineered the restroom denial to create leverage. A ridiculous claim, but dangerous in the age of sound bites. Soon, op-eds appeared in fringe outlets, their headlines provocative. Did Marcus Ellington manufacture a crisis, an orchestrated outrage? The power play behind Clear Skies? Marcus read one of the pieces late at night in his study, the words crawling across the screen like poison. He could almost hear Turner's smug voice behind the smear. The very man who had sneered at him on Flight 227 was now working in the shadows, feeding doubt into the bloodstream of public opinion. Phoebe stormed into his office the next morning, her face tight. They've hired a private firm to dig. They're pulling at every loose thread. Marcus, business rivals, political connections, even Simone. The mention of Simone's name hit like a blade. Marcus's late wife had nothing to do with this, nothing but the memory she left him. Yet already a tabloid had published an old photo of them together, framing her as part of some ambition narrative. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He could weather attacks on himself, but not on her memory. "They're trying to exhaust us," he murmured. "If they can't break the message, they'll try to break the messenger." Phoebe leaned forward, voice steady but low. "Then we double down on transparency. We don't just defend your integrity, we show them what real integrity looks like." That afternoon, Marcus called a press conference. Reporters filled the hall, many expecting a defensive statement. Instead, Marcus stood at the podium with a folder of documents in his hand. "You've seen headlines questioning my motives," he began, his voice calm. "I won't dignify lies with denial. Instead, I'll show you what they fear." He held up the folder. "This is a compilation of passenger testimonies collected in just the past week. 54 individuals from across this country who experienced humiliation while flying, who filed complaints, and who were ignored. Their stories are not orchestrated, their pain is not manufactured, and their dignity will no longer be dismissed." He began reading excerpts aloud. A teenage boy forced to give up his seat because a platinum member demanded it. An elderly black woman made to wait while attendants served wine to newer passengers. A Middle Eastern father interrogated for 15 minutes before being allowed to board with his daughter. Each story landed heavy in the room, each pause filled with silence from reporters who had expected scandal and instead received testimony of systemic rot. When Marcus finished, he set the folder down gently. "If anyone wants to question why I act, let them first answer why these voices were silenced." The broadcast went viral again, but this time the smear campaign faltered. Public opinion hardened not around suspicion, but around solidarity. Hashtags shifted from his name back to the stories. Dukum voices in the sky. We belong here. Still, Turner and his allies weren't done. Behind the scenes, they pushed regulators to stall Clear Skies, arguing it was overreach. Anonymous calls reached shareholders warning of financial risk. A handful of board members who had reluctantly signed the reforms began wavering. Marcus knew this would be the true test. It wasn't enough to force signatures in a room. He had to secure permanence against backlash, and permanence required allies. That night, Phoebe arranged a discreet meeting at a hotel suite in Washington, D.C. Leaders from passenger rights groups, disability advocates, civil rights coalitions, and even former airline employees gathered. Many had never sat at the same table before. Marcus walked in quietly, not as a CEO towering over them, but as a man who knew he needed them. He spoke simply. "They're trying to outlast me. But this isn't about me. If Clear Skies is tied to one man, it will die when the pressure does. If it's tied to all of you, it will live." The room murmured with cautious energy. An advocate for disabled travelers leaned forward. "You're saying we don't just support this. We own it with you." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. Clear Skies isn't my reform. It's our covenant, shared, protected, expanded. The coalition agreed. Together they drafted an open letter, signed by dozens of organizations, calling not only for Sky Nation's compliance, but for every airline in the country to adopt Clear Skies standards. The letter, published in major newspapers, reframed the narrative overnight. No longer was this Marcus Ellington's crusade. It was a collective demand for dignity. The pushback intensified. Sky Nation's old guard, though officially resigned, still had friends in politics. Congressional hearings were whispered about. Regulators pressured. Turner's allies leaked documents attempting to frame Marcus as too powerful, claiming Orion's influence threatened competition. For a moment, it seemed the reform might stall in bureaucracy. But then something unexpected happened. Passengers themselves mobilized. Thousands began emailing airlines, demanding clear skies. Parents refused to book family vacations with carriers who hadn't signed on. A viral campaign encouraged travelers to switch their tickets, costing some airlines millions in cancellations. Marcus sat at his desk watching this unfold. Humbled, ordinary people had taken what began as his humiliation and turned it into leverage no boardroom could ignore. Still, the attacks gnawed at him privately. Late one evening, he sat in his office alone, city lights glittering through the glass. He opened a drawer and pulled out a photo of Simone. He spoke softly into the quiet. "They'll never understand what kept me steady, but you would." His hand trembled as he traced the frame. For all his composure, he was human, carrying grief, carrying weight. Phoebe entered quietly, pausing at the doorway. She saw the photo, the heaviness in his posture. She didn't speak at first, then gently. "You don't have to carry her memory as a shield. Marcus, let it be your anchor." He looked up at her, eyes tired but resolute. "If I falter, Phoebe, they'll say it proves them right." "No," she replied firmly. "If you falter, it proves you're human. And that's why they trust you." Her words stayed with him. The next morning, when another smear headline surfaced, Marcus didn't respond defensively. Instead, he issued a statement not about himself, but about the coalition. "This movement is bigger than any one leader. Attempts to distract from it will fail, because the truth belongs to everyone who has ever been silenced." The smear campaign began to wither. Each attack only drew more attention to the stories Marcus amplified. What began as a restroom denial had become a national conversation about who is treated with dignity in public spaces. And though Turner's resentment still simmered, Marcus understood something vital the more they tried to center him, the more he had to step aside and let others speak. That was the twist none of his adversaries had expected, that the most powerful man in the room would choose not to dominate it, but to widen it. The resistance had come hard, but the storm had revealed something stronger, a movement no longer dependent on Marcus Ellington alone. Weeks turned into months, and what had begun as a humiliating moment at a restroom door evolved into one of the most significant cultural shifts the airline industry had ever seen. Marcus Ellington never stopped moving meetings in Washington, late-night calls with advocacy leaders, strategy sessions with Phoebe Tran, but the most powerful evidence of change didn't come from boardrooms or press releases. It came from passengers. Stories continued to flood social media. A black teenager on a flight from Atlanta to Chicago posted a video of a flight attendant apologizing to him after mistakenly questioning his first-class boarding pass, an apology offered quickly and sincerely, something that might never have happened before. A disabled veteran shared a photo of his service dog resting peacefully beside him, noting that the crew had offered extra space without hesitation. A mother of 3 wrote about how the captain himself had come back to help her store her stroller, telling her, "Every passenger matters." These were small gestures, perhaps, but they were signs of a deeper shift. People began to notice, to believe that dignity in the skies wasn't a dream but a reality slowly taking root. Inside Sky Nation, The Clear Skies initiative reshaped the company. The old board members who had resigned were replaced with leaders who came from diverse backgrounds, people who understood firsthand the weight of bias. Independent complaint review boards were formed, staffed not by airline executives, but by external advocates and community representatives. The first public report was released after 6 months, acknowledging failures openly and charting measurable progress. For once, transparency wasn't just a word in a brochure. Marcus had insisted on one symbolic reform that became a headline in itself: the transformation of Sky Nation's premium lounge in New York. At the entrance, where once a wall of glossy portraits of executives had hung, there now stood a simple plaque etched with words, "Every door opens with dignity. For every passenger. Always." Travelers paused to take photos of it, sharing them with captions like, "This is what change looks like." But while progress unfolded, Marcus knew resistance still lingered. Turner remained active, though quieter, working his connections in political circles. Rumors circulated about new lobbying efforts to roll back oversight, to argue that reforms burdened airlines financially. Marcus kept a close eye, but refused to let fear define his focus. One evening, Marcus returned home to his penthouse overlooking the bay. The city lights glimmered like scattered stars, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to sit quietly without a meeting or call pressing in. He poured a glass of water and sat by the window, the hum of distant traffic filling the silence. On the table beside him lay Simone's photograph. He reached for it, studying her smile. He spoke softly. Words carried into the stillness. "We did it, Simone. Not just me, all of us. You'd tell me not to carry it alone. And I think I finally learned how." His phone buzzed with a message from Phoebe. She had just returned from Washington after presenting the Clear Skies Covenant to a congressional subcommittee. "It's happening." The message read, "Momentum is unstoppable now." Marcus smiled faintly. The battle had started with humiliation, but it had ended with dignity, not his alone, but shared across thousands of lives. The following week, Marcus was invited to give a keynote at a national summit on corporate accountability. The stage was vast, the hall filled with leaders, activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens. As he stepped to the podium, he paused, taking in the sight of so many different faces gathered together. His words were simple. "I was denied a restroom once. It was meant to remind me of limits, of where I didn't belong. But what happened after showed me something greater. That dignity doesn't come from privilege. It comes from how we treat one another in the quiet moments when no one is watching. And when we fail, as we all do, dignity comes from how we repair what was broken." The audience sat silent, drawn in. "I don't stand here as a man who won." Marcus continued, "I stand here as one of many who refused to look away. Change didn't come because I had power. Change came because ordinary people demanded it, because you refused to stay silent, because we turned humiliation into accountability and accountability into hope." The applause that followed was long and steady. People rose to their feet, not just for Marcus, but for themselves, for the belief that they, too, were part of something larger. After the summit, a young woman approached him backstage. She wore a simple suit, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My father was on that flight," she said. "He told me he'd never seen anyone handle injustice with such calm. It made him believe again that things can change. Thank you for him, and for me." Marcus clasped her hand warmly. "Tell your father it wasn't calm," he said with a quiet smile. "It was choice. We all get to choose, even in the hardest moments." As he left the hall, Marcus felt a sense of closure. The restroom door that had once symbolized shame was now only a memory. In its place stood something far greater, a movement, a covenant, a legacy. Back in San Francisco, Marcus and Phoebe met one last time in Orion's boardroom. The city stretched out below them, the sun dipping low over the water. "You know," Phoebe said, her tone softer than usual, "this started with them trying to close one door on you, and now you've opened 1,000 for others." Marcus leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's the lesson. Doors will close, some with malice, some with ignorance. But what matters is that we keep opening more, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after." Phoebe smiled faintly, a rare warmth in her sharp features. Clear skies isn't just policy anymore. It's legacy. Marcus looked out the window, the horizon painted in gold. He thought of Simone, of passengers who had found their voices, of strangers who now believed they belonged in spaces once denied. And for the first time since that humiliating moment on Flight 227, Marcus Ellington allowed himself to feel not just resolve, but peace. The story of Marcus Ellington reminds us that true strength isn't measured by how loud we shout when wronged, but by how firmly we stand in silence. In a world quick to judge and slow to listen, Marcus showed that dignity, patience, and truth are more powerful than rage. He turned a moment of personal humiliation into a system-wide reform that restored fairness for thousands who would never have his influence or voice. For older audiences who have seen the weight of life's injustices, this story speaks deeply. It's never too late to stand for what's right, and no act of calm courage ever goes unnoticed. Whether in a boardroom, a neighborhood, or a family, choosing grace over anger doesn't mean weakness, it means control. Marcus didn't just shut down an airline, he opened doors for others. His story reminds us that leadership is not about dominance, it's about transformation. And when one person stands tall for dignity, they lift us all a little higher. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. If this story touched your heart or made you think a little deeper about justice and respect, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more powerful true-to-life stories that remind us what humanity really means. Your support keeps these voices alive. Stay kind, stay strong, and remember, dignity belongs to everyone,